It is fitting, I think, to begin this evening our Second Annual Aquinas Lecture with a prayer from the Angelic Doctor. So I will recite an excerpt from his prayer to obtain virtues. O God, all-powerful, who knowest all things, who hadst neither beginning nor end, who dost give, preserve, and reward all virtues, deign to make me steadfast on the solid foundation of faith, to protect me with the impregnable shield of hope, and to adorn me with the wedding garment of charity. Amen. So welcome to Dean Payne, to members of the faculty, to Father Aquinas, to students, and all of our guests this evening. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by the Center for Law and the Human Person here in the law school. So for those of you not familiar with our center or our mission, let me just say a word about it. I am privileged to serve along with Professor Mark DiGirolami as co-director of the center, which is now in its fourth year of academic programming. The mission of the center is to be a central resource for connecting the fundamental principles that animate our law school, such as dignity of the human person, the inviolability of all human life, and justice rooted in the common good, to connect these principles to the study and the teaching and the practice of law. And we do that by sponsoring academic symposia and lectures like tonight's, but also by supporting scholarly research, curricular development, and in particular, we emphasize student formation. So to that end, I encourage you to look on the table afterwards for flyers of our upcoming events. You can join our email list with the sign-in sheet to stay informed of future events, and you can visit our website where we host videos of past events and where you can learn more about the center. So as I said, this is our second annual Aquinas Lecture. The inaugural lecture was given last year by Father Aquinas Gilbo. And you might be tempted to think that he was both the inaugural and the eponymous lecturer, but of course the lecture is named for his namesake, St. Thomas Aquinas. But in his lecture last year, Father Aquinas reflected on Pope St. John Paul II's great Thomistic encyclical Veritatis Splendor, especially its understanding of freedom as dependent on truth and freedom's relationship to the law. And in an especially beautiful passage that I have thought about and quoted many times, Father Aquinas described the role of law like this. On the one hand, law observes the natures of things and gathers from them a wisdom for living. This is the contemplative quality of law. On the other hand, law gathers what it learns from how things are and translates that knowledge into precepts that coordinate the activity of a people, which coordination aims at freeing persons from any number of obstacles that prevent their participation in the common good. In this way, law promotes freedom. Law serves freedom by ensuring the social and political conditions necessary for persons to live according to right reason. So you might be thinking, after listening to that this was a hard act to follow. Who could I find to give the second Aquinas lecture? But I will have you know that tonight's speaker was actually Father Aquinas' dissertation director, right? So maybe at the reception, Father Aquinas can tell us if everything he knows is really learned from Father Michael Sherwin. Okay, so to introduce tonight's speaker. Father Michael Sherwin is professor of fundamental moral theology and director of the Institute of Spirituality at the Angelicum in Rome. The history of the Angelicum, by the way, goes back to the medieval Dominican House of Studies in Rome, founded in the 13th century, in which St. Thomas Aquinas himself taught. Among its more recent students was then Karol Wojtyła, Pope St. John Paul II. On a recent visit of mine to Rome, Father Sherwin showed me the olive tree in the Angelicum garden under which John Paul was known to have read and studied. Father Sherwin joined the faculty at the Angelicum after almost 20 years of teaching at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. He has also taught at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, California, where he received his initial formation as a Dominican and was ordained a priest in 1991. author of articles on the psychology of love, virtue ethics, and moral development, his monograph, By Knowledge and by Love, has become a standard Thomistic reference, while Alistair MacIntyre has described Father Sherwin's published collection of essays on love and virtue as theological reflection at its best. On a personal note, I was very honored to first meet Father Sherwin in 2007 when he held the Miser Visiting Fellowship at the University of Notre Dame's Center for Ethics and Culture, where I was then Associate Director. That year, I don't know if Father remembers this, my husband and I welcomed our first child after many years of praying for such a gift, and he was one of the first to share in our joy at that news. Another personal note, Father Sherwin has this exquisite capacity to always illuminate the deeper, richer, spiritual dimension of earthly pleasures. So, for example, I think of his great loves, the music of the jazz pianist and composer Dave Brubeck, or the joys of horseback riding, or as in my case, he was always encouraging in me to appreciate the richer dimensions of married love and motherhood. So I am very pleased to welcome Father Michael Sherwin. His presentation this evening is entitled On Love, Law, and Virtue, or of Chairs and Charity. Thank you.
Yes, I remember taking a picture of the littlest, the new addition to the Kirk home, in the arms of Professor David Soliver. So, on love, law, and virtue, or of chairs and charity. The life so short, let me see, I'll give you the original English. The life so short, the craft so long to learn, the essay so hard, so sharp the conquering, the fearful joy that slips away in turn. All this mean I by love. With these opening words of the Parliament of Fowls, Chaucer describes love as a craft, or as an ars or techne that requires long effort to learn. The craft so long to learn, the essay so hard, so sharp the conquering. This notion is not original to him. Ovid had long before written a 3-volume study of the ars amatoria, study of the art of love. As Ovid explains, just as, quote, it is by art that ships advance with oar and sail, and by art that the chariots' horses spring ahead, so too love is to be ruled by art. Arte regendus amor. Thomas Aquinas, who lived during that era known to scholars as the Age of Ovid, was well aware of Ovid's portrayal of love as an art. Indeed, he even quotes from the Ars Amatoria. Aquinas, however, would affirm that, strictly speaking, love is distinct from art. Art, which Aquinas defines as right reason about things to be made, recta ratio factibilium, while it disposes the artisan to make excellent things, it does not, let's see, I just lost my place here. To make excellent things, it does not dispose the artisan to live well. One who has acquired the craft of carpentry, for example, becomes a good carpenter, but on its own, this artisanal excellence does not make him a good person. One can be an excellent carpenter and a wicked person. To be a good person requires well-ordered affections, which of course is at the very heart of love. To learn to love, therefore, requires more than art. It requires the virtues, especially the virtue of practical wisdom, phronesis or prudentia, which Aquinas defines as right reason about doing, or about things doable, as opposed to about making, recta ratio agibilium. But Thomas Aquinas nevertheless recognizes that the analogies drawn from the arts are apt. Plato, Aristotle, and the great moral educator Plutarch all employed analogies from the arts and crafts to explain the dynamics of virtue. From this perspective, although love is not strictly speaking a craft, it is like a craft. And thus, we can learn about the ways of love and love's relationship to the virtues by studying the ways of the artisan. Specifically, we can acquire a clearer understanding of the nature and role of rules, regula, of law in love and virtue by studying how rules function in the crafts. This evening, I wish to do so by focusing on the craftsmanship of the chairmaker, or of what the French call the menuisier en siège. First, however, to help us understand why this turn to the rough ground of the artisan is necessary for our renewed understanding of the natural law, I wish to lead us on a brief historical excursus. The year is 1888. Europe is undergoing rapid and radical changes. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing, creating more wealth and prosperity than Europe has ever seen before, but also creating increasingly desperate and violent labor unrest. Most Europeans at this time still see themselves and their nations as Christian. At the same time, however, European society at all levels is increasingly animated by Enlightenment and Romantic philosophies that are anything but Christian. It is in this context that Friedrich Nietzsche, aged 44, while on vacation at the beautiful Swiss lake resort of Sils Maria, will pen his last great work, The Twilight of the Idols, whose subtitle explains a lot: How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Written in 10 days during a rare period of health for the increasingly feeble and virtually blind Nietzsche, the book expresses in condensed form the ideas that have become the obsession of its author. Nietzsche articulates what he believes is an inauthenticity lived at the heart of European society. Interestingly, he sees this inauthenticity especially present among the English. I think he would include us among them. Quote, I think I've got that quote here. They are rid of the Christian God and are now all the more convinced that they have to hold on to Christian morality. This is an English kind of consequential reasoning, or English kind of consistency, depending on how you translate the German. The rest of us see things differently, by which he means secular Europeans. If you abandon the Christian faith, at the same time, you are pulling the right to Christian morality out from under your feet. Nietzsche continues, this morality is very far from self-evident. This point needs highlighting time and again, English fatheads notwithstanding. I cut that part out of the slide there. If the English really do believe they know by themselves intuitively what is good and evil, he's thinking of Locke here, if they therefore think they no longer need Christianity as a guarantee of morality, then this is itself merely the consequence of the dominance of Christian value judgments and an expression of the strength and depth of this dominance, with the result that the origin of English morality has been forgotten, and the highly qualified nature of its right to exist is no longer felt. For the English, morality is not yet a problem. This is in 1888. For the English, morality is not yet a problem. Prophetic words. In 1888, the titans of the 20th century were already in their early childhoods. Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, and their many lieutenants. By their actions and by the actions of the societies they helped create, the confidence in the self-evidency of moral truth, even the truths of our humble Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, will be over the course of the 20th century deeply shaken. Indeed, anyone who knows the history of the return to virtue ethics will hear the echo of Nietzsche's words in Elizabeth Anscombe's groundbreaking critique of modern moral philosophy that she penned almost exactly 70 years after Nietzsche's observations. Over the span of those 70 years, 2 world wars would occur that would lead to the death of over 70 million people, many of whom were non-combatants, women, children, the sick, the elderly, including the industrially organized killing of Jews and other non-desirables. Added to this are the many millions, perhaps as many as 20 million, who died as the result of Stalin's actions in the Soviet Union over these same 70 years. This veritable symphony of death should have drowned out any Enlightenment confidence in self-evident rights. Miss Anscombe, however, observed that as late as 1958, British moral philosophy continued to propose an unfounded notion of moral obligation. I can do a parenthesis here. I don't know how many of you know the context of her writing that essay. So the essay is Modern Moral Philosophy. How many of you have heard of the essay? How many have read the essay? Okay, so modern moral philosophy appears like a hand grenade in the sandbox of mid-century moral philosophers in the English language, because she concludes by saying, until we have solved the problem that I point out, we should just stop doing ethics because we are talking nonsense. So how does the essay start? She argues that arguments between moralities based on the observance of rules or deontology, between them and utilitarians, those who promoted ethics based on utility, or what she calls consequentialists. She coins the term consequentialist ethics. That these arguments between these two camps are interminable because they both presuppose an unjustified notion of moral obligation. And similar to Nietzsche, she pinpoints the source of this obligation in a certain understanding of Christian morality and Christian law. She has in mind here the notion of law developed by the Anglican divines and then fine-tuned by people like Locke, where law, the natural law, is an expression of the divine will, not based on nature, but just an expression of the divine will, and we are subject to it. And Locke makes it very clear, if God doesn't exist, well then people, and there are no rewards or punishments for our behavior in this life, after death, well then people should just do whatever they want. He makes that very clear. The whole morality he's arguing for, and his notion of the moral law and of morality, is based on this kind of divine command understanding of the natural law. It's this that she says is presupposed in the arguments of the deontologists and the consequentialists. Why? She asked the question, well, why should I have to act according to formal abstract rules? Why should I have to act according to the utility of the greatest? From whence comes this ought? And she says it's the vestige of their Christian heritage, very similar to what Nietzsche argued. In order, therefore, not to fall into this, something new is needed. Alistair MacIntyre, drawing on her work, will subsequently affirm that the situation of modern moral philosophy is analogous to 18th century Hawaiians and their use of the word taboo. King Kamehameha II and his Polynesian subjects could not explain what they meant by taboo when they were quizzed about it by Captain Cook and his crew. They were thus found to be living by obligations, the sources of which were long forgotten. Not surprisingly, therefore, Kamehameha II was able to abolish taboo with little resistance from his followers. This leads MacIntyre to affirm, why should we think about our modern uses of good, right, and obligatory in any different way from that in which we think about late 18th century Polynesian uses of taboo? And why should we not think of Nietzsche as the Kamehameha II of the European tradition? He then goes on. It is Nietzsche, I think I actually have these quotations too for you. It was Nietzsche's historic achievement to understand more clearly than any other philosopher, certainly more clearly than his counterparts in Anglo-Saxon emotivism and continental existentialism, not only that what purported to be appeals to objectivity were in fact expressions of subjective will, but also the nature of the problems that this posed for moral philosophy. So, we're in the state of not having a foundation for taboo. Does this foundation for moral obligation? Does this mean that natural law is a fiction, and that those who appeal to its precepts are the contemporary equivalents of 18th century Polynesians appealing to taboo? No, MacIntyre and Anscombe will conclude, but it does point to the fictive character of the Enlightenment's confidence in reason and suggest the way forward is to return to an older, non-rationalist account of the natural law. One that, let me see here, old natural law, one that abandons notions of self-evidency for the more traditional conception of truths that are per se nota, known in the act of knowing anything, known and presupposed in every practical action and judgment, even when our judgments are faulty or erroneous. From this perspective, we need to develop an account of the natural law that contains a theory of error, that explains how principles universally known by all can nonetheless not be followed by all, and a theory of moral development, how one learns to live according to the precepts of the natural law. For both MacIntyre and Anscombe, this renewed account of moral obligation and the moral law requires first and foremost a return to the question of human flourishing as the goal of human life. Human flourishing and the actions, traits of character, the virtues that promote this flourishing. As Anscombe explains, what is needed is, quote, an account of human nature, human action, the types of characteristic of virtue is, and above all, an account of human flourishing. From this perspective, we determine what we ought to do from an analysis of those actions that lead to integral human flourishing and of human nature, of humans properly understood as rational and political social animals. When we, another historical moment of interest is when Cardinal Ratzinger, at one of the last acts that he did before he became Pope, when he was the head of the International Theological Commission, he asked different universities, pontifical faculties of theology and philosophy around the world to answer the question or study the question of whether the Catholic Church should continue to make appeals to the natural law when writing about ethical and social issues. At Notre Dame, they responded to this call to discuss the question by asking Alistair MacIntyre to answer it, and then they would write different individuals on the faculties of philosophy and theology would write their responses to his essay. And interestingly, in the essay, after quoting the Catechism and then quoting Aquinas' famous essay on the first principles of the natural law, he then underlines the need to offer an account of error and an account of how, as Aquinas says, whole populations can, although they have the principles of the natural law, not live according to the conclusions or the secondary precepts of the natural law. Quoting Caesar, he gives the example of how in certain tribes in Northern Europe, they have no notion of private property. Another example that I can draw on from my own experience, one of our friars in Freiburg was from a tribal family in the Ivory Coast, and his grandfather was a tribal chief, raised as a pagan, and had a reservation about accepting baptism, as the rest of his family had done, because in his village, women who were not married would basically starve to death. And so one of the roles of the chief was to marry the unmarried women so that they would not starve. They would be in his household. Now, you can make the argument, especially when you look at the Old Testament, the patriarchs having multiple wives, that it is of the natural law, monogamy is of the natural law, but it is possible through practices and through certain situations for a whole people not to see the truth of it, to not see the secondary principle that if you understand the nature of marriage, you can see that it must be monogamous. And that's another example of where certain practices, Aquinas calls them corrupt practices, can lead, and certain economic, social situations can lead people not to arrive at the conclusion that is inherent in the secondary precepts of the natural law. So, what does MacIntyre say we should do? Following that quotation from Wittgenstein, he says we should return to the rough ground of human practices and see how people learn the primary precepts of the natural law, learn to put them into practice. So that's what I want to turn to now. And this is where the analogy with chair making becomes interesting. Is this a chair? What do you think? You think you could sit on that? So Picasso's chair is in a museum. Now, there are some chairs in museums, but chairs that are designed and then produced and mass-produced are not in museums. They usually are in people's homes. You're sitting on a chair. So now the question becomes, what is the role of the regula of chair making, which Picasso self-consciously has violated? If you try to sit on that chair for any amount of time, you're going to be very uncomfortable. You're going to slide off. It's more of a joke than an actual chair. Now, it is a wonderful example of contemporary self-expression, but it's not a chair as we mean by chairs. To make a chair, and we're going through kind of a design renaissance in chair making at the moment. To make a chair, you have to respect just a small limit of rules that are mainly geometric proportions between the ankle and the knee and the hip and between the pelvis and the head. And then if you respect this limited group of regula based on the objective bodily forms of people, they say you can make a chair, if you're going to have a general form, it needs to be able to be usable by 90% of the population. But again, all of these different design norms, they are based in something rooted in human nature, rooted in human experience of trying to sit for long periods of time in one way or another. There are many examples in this room. Think about all of the engineering prowess that had to go into the chair you're sitting in and why you're able to sit in it. There is a respect for certain basic regula rooted in human nature that allows the artisan to make the chair you're sitting in. It doesn't limit his freedom. This is the interesting thing about the internet and this kind of renaissance in design. There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of different types of chair. And there are people who become, there's a lot of argument on the internet about what's the best design, what's the best universal design. There are people who are partisans of a certain type of chair. It goes on and on and on. But they all share in common, because they are chairs and that there are people who are willing to mass produce them, a respect for certain basic regula. So the regula rooted in human nature doesn't limit the freedom of the artisan, but becomes the condition for the possibility of making the chair. So you've got some of the proportions set up for this chair here. You see how they try to look at the geometry of it. So the questions to ask here: what constitutes a chair? Was Picasso's chair really a chair? What are the minimum requirements of a chair? Does following these requirements constrain freedom or make the artist radically free? It's within this context that the person discovers how to live the precepts of the natural law. This is true for the artisan. Might it also be true for the person acquiring the virtues? There's another example of the designs, chair design. That's a very popular chair. And I found that if you look on the internet, you can find lots of different discussions of this design. Now, how does this point to learning to love? If love is a craft, then by analogy with how crafts are learned, we can look at how love relates to virtue and the learning to love. So how do people learn the craft of making a chair? How do people learn the craft of anything? They learn it through an apprenticeship. So let's look at the elements of apprenticeship. Here's someone playing piano, but you can do it for making a chair. 5 features proper to learning any skill. The standard of excellence. Now, what I mean by standard of excellence is someone who embodies the activity. So I had a friend who was an apprentice who wanted to become a Tischler. We in America, we don't quite have this. It's between a cabinet maker and a carpenter. In order to become a Tischler in the German system, you have to be able to make a secretarial desk that has that roll top and all the little drawers. So that was his goal. So the standard of excellence is the Tischler himself, the skilled furniture maker. And then you have to trust that the Tischler you're working with as an apprentice is really an expert in the field, and that doing what he tells you to do will lead you to becoming a Tischler. Now, this friend of mine, he started out being given what he thought was nonsensical tasks, and they were all different woodwork tasks to learn how to eventually become very familiar with all the different types of wood, the different grains, their different properties, to eventually be able to make the cabinet, the secretarial desk that was the goal of his working. So too, for that unique genre of the menuisier en siège, to become an expert chair maker. You have to know the properties of wood, the different wood you're using, oak, walnut, and you do this, first of all, by becoming an apprentice who embodies the excellence of chair making. You have to trust what the expert tells you to do. So this kid here is doing scales. In order to learn how to play piano, you have to trust that learning scales is eventually going to lead you to attain the standard of excellence that you seek. And the learning of scales is a form of internalizing the rules. And this is where Alistair McIntyre's appeal to practices as the location of where we discover what's really at the heart of the role of law in the arts and in the virtues and in love. You acquire, where do we learn what the rules are? Where do we learn the primary precept? If the primary precept of the natural law is to do good, avoid evil, where do we learn that? Aquinas says it's not self-evident, it's per se nota. You know it in any act of knowing anything in a practical judgment. By analogy, with speculative knowledge. When the kid sees the ice cream fall out of the cone and hit the ground, the kid knows, even though the kid cannot articulate the principle of non-contradiction, the kid knows that the ice cream is not simultaneously on the ground and in the cone. So that those analogously in practical judgments, the call to do good and avoid evil, and all the different levels of life, how we eat, how we sleep. Those who are parents know that constant initiating of the child into these different practices is how they learn to discover the natural law and to apply it, even though they can't say that it's the natural, they can't articulate it reflexively, but they are learning the basic precepts. So love, like learning any trade, is discovered how to love, how to treat our parents, how to treat our siblings, how to will the good for them, which is Aquinas' definition of the basic act of love, to will the good of another, to desire that, to do it by all we say and do, to promote the good of the other. How we learn that in the context of the practices of daily life. And again, the analogy. Now, for law, that is for the practice of law, which I think is all what all of you are ultimately wanting to be engaged in. What's the relationship between these natural law principles and the law? In another way of articulating that, what is the relationship between the natural law and the common law, and the way in which the common law is practiced in a society that uses precedent and judgment of cases? That's something I think we can discuss at question and answer period, but I want to just look a little bit more closely at these stages. You have the standard of excellence, so the chairmaker. You have the trust in the expert. You have to trust the chairmaker. You have the practices that allow you to discover, as we saw here in the earlier slide, it allows you to discover the regula, the rules of chairmaking, the proportions between shoulders, neck, pelvis, knee, ankle, the feet, all of that. You learn that by doing, and you learn that by being involved in activities that put you in contact with those regula. And then in childhood, as in any apprenticeship, there's a social context to this learning. There's not really a solo chairmaker. I mean, there are people who work alone, but people who are apprentices normally learn in context with others. You see this in learning languages, a foreign language. You see this in learning your own language. You see this in learning a musical instrument. There's the social context by which you've internalized the rules through activities, and then whether it's in learning a foreign language, the vignettes of dialogues of ordering a cup of coffee or anything like that, and then music concerts for musicians who are learning to play a piece of music amongst their fellows who are at the same level. But the key here is the notion of freedom that comes from having internalized the rules. The chairmaker who has internalized these relationships is now empowered to make any number of chairs. And again, I invite you on your own time to look on the internet at the abundance of chair designs that are out, popular, available, that you can buy, and they all have their differences, but they all have that common respect for the regula, unlike those strange chairs that are in museums, like Picasso's so-called chair, the chairs that no one sits in. So freedom, the chairmaker now has the freedom to do something he or she could not do before, make a chair. And those who those who have been initiated into the life and practices of familial love and love in a community, caring for others, doing the activities of family life with love. They learn this in the context of the practices of daily life. And the rules are instantiated. They learn the rules by doing. Now, if you were to turn to an introductory account of the common law, and there are some beautiful pages by someone who I often do not agree with, by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s classic study of the common law, he basically describes, of course it's unlinked from any notion of human nature, but he basically describes that the common law is born of experience, born of day-to-day experience. And what he is describing is in need of a renewed non-rationalist, because he had clearly rejected that by the time he wrote that book, account of law and of human nature. Something we discover anew, but is always the same. Human nature in new situations, learning to love, and then the virtues. Aquinas is very clear that you live charity, love of God and neighbor, through the virtues and through the judgment that comes from prudence, through the activity of rendering to others what is their due in justice, through the act of courage, which primarily is lived in patient endurance in trial, and the act of terribly named temperance. The Greek is much richer. Temperantia in Latin is a translation that even Jerome refuses to use. The Greek is sophrosune, the virtue of being in your right mind, as the gateway to all the virtues, having a well-ordered affections, so that you love sensate good in a way that allows you to love spiritual good. So all of those four cardinal virtues lived through, the charity is lived through them, and of course for the Christian with faith and hope, which if you look closely at how Aquinas describes faith, it's very much by analogy with the apprenticeship of the moral life. We believe God, and we believe and live that faith through an apprenticeship with Christ. All right, so what then are the implications to conclude? For a communal understanding of the natural law, if we're going to have a legal system that at least presupposes an awareness of the general regula of human nature, it presupposes, therefore, communities where these truths are lived. We are increasingly living in societies where technology, techne, separates us from concrete experiences of family life, daily life, human nature, and indeed animal nature. So the renewal of law, learning love, learning virtue cannot be separated from the practices of a local Christian community. This is what Chaucer's whole book, The Parliament of Fowls, attempt to present in kind of a menagerie analogy of birds, that the skill of love is long to learn, but we learn it in community. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for about 15 minutes of questions, and this will not amplify your voice, but it will record it for the recording. So.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk, and I had a question concerning the connection between what we do and the knowledge that it is good. Because at one point in your talk, you mentioned that, you know, being, let's say, a good chairmaker or a good lawyer is about, if it's about craft or about learning certain certain skills that one acquires through practice. How does one bridge the what is often thought to be the divide between doing things, the practices of doing things, and knowing that what we do is good? Because one could imagine a criticism that might say something like, well, first we have to start with the principles of what's good so that we can then know that what we do is good. We can't go the other way. We can't say simply by repeated behaviors we access the good. But it seemed to me that maybe you were suggesting something like this, Father.
Oh, well, I think there's the via inventionis and there's the via disciplinae. So there's the presentation proper to the discipline, and then there's the presentation that's proper to the way these truths are discovered. And so let's look again back to history. Rationalism arises because of the collapse of the religious unity of Europe. I think Cardinal Manning is actually exactly right. All human conflict at the end of the day is ultimately religious, and all the great Enlightenment figures are traumatized by the end of kind of moral and spiritual unity of Europe, and the religious wars are even more horrifying because you have, for example, the battle that Descartes witnessed, he was present at, was a battle where a Christian prince, Cardinal Richelieu, had made an alliance with Swedish Protestants to attack the Holy Roman Empire, Catholics. So you have Catholics and Protestants attacking each other, apparently for religious reasons. It was all, so Descartes' systematic doubt and his attempt to create a kind of scientifically clear understanding of morals is an attempt to overcome the chaos of the time. What MacIntyre argues when he describes Nietzsche as the Kamehameha of our generation is he points out that this is a mythic attempt to overcome the particularity of where you learn moral truth. All right, now, of course, that begs the question as to if communities can get it wrong, like the tribes in Northern Europe or different, wherever you are. They're in the Jesuit relations. There was a wonderful account of how they asked one of the old widows who had been many years a Christian, and they asked her what she missed most about her life before Christianity or in her childhood. And she said something like she loved, people like, there's some people who love pig knuckles. She loved infant knuckles. I mean, so clearly there are ways in which human communities on their own, reflecting on human experience, can get certain things really wrong. So how do you adjudicate? And I think that's the burden of almost all of the attempts to renew virtue ethics, is how you can have a conversation across communities as to, but the main point is the notion of the good comes from an antecedent notion of human flourishing. So it's not as if it's a formal imposition of the notion of good, but that every community, consciously or unconsciously, and this is the key here, it's not as if we can stand outside this theory and see other people living other theories. If what the Catholic and the traditional natural law tradition is saying, from a non-rationalist account of it, is that even those who get it wrong, if you look carefully, we can see that they have knowledge of the primary precepts. And because of that, we can have a conversation with them about, hey, our vision more fully answers the very thing you are seeking. So that when a society is confronted with another, Black Elk is a wonderful example of the Ogallala Sioux. Unfortunately, a lot of stuff was published that falsified his real life. When Black Elk Black Elk was a chief of the Oglala Sioux, he became a Catholic and became a catechist to evangelize his people. He made these wonderful visual scrolls for non-literate people to understand the gospel. And what he says that one of the things that allowed him to embrace the gospel, besides extraordinary graces that he'd received, visions and things, was that his own culture had taught him to accept the truth wherever he found it, even if from your enemy. So there was a conversation that was possible where he discovered that his enemies' answers to life's questions, they answered them better than his own culture did. So the truths of the natural law, the primary precepts of the natural law, are presupposed in every culture, but people don't always see the implications. And so the challenge becomes to live in such a way that other cultures can see that our way of living answers the question better than theirs. And therefore, we can also have a conversation across culture as to, hey, this way of treating non-combatants is better than the way you've been doing it. And you yourselves should be able to see that truth by how we treat you as non-combatants, things like that. Now, the wheels fall off the rails in Western society. This is why Nietzsche is so important. He foresees it. He foresees that there is a kind of falsity in Western moral teaching by mid-19th century, and it torments him. People think he's a nihilist. He's not. He's the prophet of nihilism, but he's a Jeremiah. I mean, he doesn't want this to be true, but he sees that it is. And so by the time you get to, it starts to unravel in American society. And I think there's some key turning points where we stop seeing what integral human flourishing really means for us as a people, and we start applying a kind of utilitarian calculus. And I think the only way you put the wheels back on is to start living in societies that take very seriously the moral wisdom of the ages and put it into practice. And that means that a lot of students at this university would have to live in a way that most of us would find very challenging, because it is very challenging to live according to the dynamism of the natural law. That's why most societies don't do it. It's hard. But we went way off the rails when I can point out several different things, but we should probably take some more questions. But I don't know if that's an answer. That it's not a prefabricated notion of good, but it's a good that emerges from the conversation about what's human flourishing, and therefore you can then have conversations with others to see how other societies either answer that question well or poorly.
Thank you, Father. I was wondering if you could comment on the role of synderesis and of conscience in the acquisition of, I suppose, moral knowledge in this kind of pursuit of human flourishing.
Two great questions. All right, so synderesis is a word that we get from Jerome. It's unfortunate. It just basically means the habit of first principles in the practical intellect. So you've got, for Aristotle, when Aristotle is translated into Latin, the habit of first speculative principles is simply called intellectus. It's the same word as the power. So the habit that contains the principles of non-contradiction, the principle that the whole is bigger than the part, all of these principles that make speculative reasoning possible, and that you can't, any act of trying to deny those principles, you would presuppose them. Any argument presupposes knowledge of these principles, and so any argument you would make against them, you'd have to presuppose knowledge of them. So like the principle of non-contradiction. Something analogous is habitually present in the practical use of the will, and that's what the tradition following Jerome calls synderesis. So it's the habit of the primary precepts of the natural law. Good is to be done, evil is to be avoided. And then all the different things that correspond to our nature, to be close, to resist death, to feed, educate, life in society, all those things that flow from the primary first principle of practical reason. Okay, which is the first principle of the natural law. And so then conscience, the notion of conscience is very much developed by Paul. And if you read closely the New Testament, you can see that conscience is something that is a judgment that we make interiorly, that we describe by analogy with a voice or even a little God that seems to speak to us. Something divine in us speaks to us about how we should act, but it ultimately is a judgment. But it's a judgment that we don't have to follow. So therefore, it's distinct from the judgment of prudence or of practical reason, the syllogism of the practical judgment. So it's on the threshold of action. And nonetheless, it contains our moral understanding of what we should do. Someone else who is in the background of my talk is Pierre Manon. Pierre Manon has also been trying to understand the relationship between law and civil society, and key people in the history who have articulated the situation in which we find ourselves. His studies of the history of liberalism, but also his studies of people like Montaigne and then also Pascal, and they're all how they relate to law. And then, of course, he's got a series of lectures on the natural law. But he sees the key element is the recovery, but the key thing that Christianity brings to the secular conversation in the pagan society was the notion of conscience, that our moral knowledge can be developed and we can act contrary to moral knowledge, but our task is to learn how to live according to our moral knowledge. So conscience is distinct from the judgment of prudence, but when the prudent person learns to follow their conscience, that the prudential judgment is simply the judgment of conscience incarnated in the command to act. But the tragic thing is, the person who doesn't have practical wisdom, who doesn't have well-ordered love, can act contrary to their conscience and can even disable conscience in the particular. Yeah.
Thank you, Father Sherwin. Just certainly hearing your voice, but also the content of your talk brought back a flood of memories of our time together.
Aquinas didn't just do his doctorate with me; he was also my doctoral assistant.
That's right. So thank you. I'd love to hear just your thoughts on the last point that you made in your paper, but just about the communities and being part of a community of apprenticeship. I'd love to hear your clarification or articulation. How real do those communities need to be? How solid, substantive, like a real let's say the real distinction between a family or a neighborhood and something that's online, for example.
You're asking a really good question. Someone who's really good on this is our friend and colleague, Craig Stephen Titus, because his dissertation, he studied all of the best of resilience studies and what are the minimum requirements for a kid, for example, to grow up with a sense of themselves and a healthy notion of human flourishing. And so the hopeful thing is you can recover from a bad background. And of course, his studies he drew together the fruit of many studies that shows that if there's just one person that a child can relate to, a coach, a teacher, who is an example of a well-ordered life that they, that standard of excellence that they aspire to. Just one. And it doesn't have to be someone that they live in the same home with, but someone who's they're regularly in contact is enough for the person to end up living a well-formed, flourishing life, in spite of all the different struggles that the person may encounter. And throughout history, there are lots of examples of people who become foremost in their field and who flourish in their life who've recovered from very bad family backgrounds. So I don't think we want to be maximalists in terms of our description of what would be. But at the same time, it would be nice to have educational and communal experiences much richer than we currently do. And this is also something that Pierre Manol is really concerned about, which is the depoliticization of the American citizen. And also someone else who I don't always agree with, but I can't resist always reading, is Victor Davis Hanson, the farmer from California, who's a classic scholar. It's also his fear of the way in which the citizen is being destroyed. Because just in my lifetime, I mean, I remember when I was teaching for one semester at Providence College, and I was teaching honor students, and I asked them how many of them know where their party's local precinct is. And I grew up being involved in local political campaigns, and it meant going door to door. It meant putting flyers on windshield wipers. It meant going to the party precinct and getting the materials, inviting people to put stuff on their front lawns. It meant meeting the candidate, meeting the candidate's family. It meant being involved in local politics and being involved in your local community. Somehow it has emerged in the interest, to have a hermeneutic of suspicion, it's the interest of someone for none of you to be involved in any of that, and to vicariously be involved in politics by simply watching a blog or listening to it. That's not politics. And Alexis de Tocqueville was very concerned that the social gathering that made the American democracy work were not imposed or mandatory. Those independent organizations that formed what he called famously now the habits of the heart. And we have been destroying those type of free associations that promote the habits of the heart. And I'm not sanguine about what's going to be the outcome of that. I think we're headed towards a real disaster because we have lost the civic virtues. But those civic virtues, you learn them by doing. And you learn them, what is it really about? It's about cultivating the loves. And we have to ask the Lord to save us from people who mean well. Someone who meant really well was the great World War II hero, George McGovern, who after his defeat and after not before his defeat, after the failure to have an anti-Vietnam candidate out of 68, he went through quietly changing the primary system throughout the United States, effectively killing what I think was party politics, because now it was going to be winner-take-all voting. And that, what he didn't see was that meant whoever had the most money would win. He got himself elected the candidate and then lost terribly. But we remain with a situation where party regulars no longer choose their candidates. We now have a candidate that no one wants on both sides. If you were to ask a Democrat or a Republican, do we have the two best people to be candidates? I don't think anyone would say that on either party. So something's broken with regard to that type of civic gathering. But you don't need to have a maximalist view because you don't want to despair of doing anything. Little things can make a difference. Now, how much of the numeric world would count for little things? That's a really good question, and I don't really have a good answer to that. I think COVID did show us that certain types of community can exist in the virtual world, but we still don't know quite what the effect of a lot of things that have happened. For example, we used to sing together. We used to sing when we worked. Ted Gioia's 3 volumes on song, work songs, healing songs, and love songs show how, and I remember living in Mexico, people sang while they work. Now we listen to music when we work. How has that changed us? How has that made us much more passive as opposed to active? We know so many things that we used to do communally, we now do singularly in different places. And I do think it's having long-term effects. And I don't think we have any idea what of how profoundly we are limiting our experience of what it means to be a social animal. You know, Aristotle's preferred term is not rational animal, it's political animal. We are, unlike other animals, we are social to a high degree. It's like you mentioned horses. One of the things that horses are absolutely fascinated by is how much we talk. We humans talk amongst ourselves. It puzzles them. We are political animals in that sense, in ways in which horses are not, even though they are herd animals, but they're not political animals. They don't talk to each other the way we do. And that puzzles our close collaborators in the world. It also puzzles dogs too, you know, but they give up trying to figure it out.